welcome to the first edition of Enzo's Garage. Regrettably, Enzo couldn't join us himself, so instead you're stuck with me. Some of you, really just one of you, thanks Aaron, have asked me to make some videos describing my thinking behind suspension tuning for the DSC Sport controller as it pertains to the 991.2 model of the Porsche 911 Carrera lineup. Much of it will apply equally well to many other cars, but there are some unique things about the 911 platform that make it a little bit different. For example, it's got a rearward weight bias, and there's that strange thing about the engine hanging off the rear. So let's take a look and see what it means as far as unique requirements are concerned a little bit later. In addition to that, the DSC Sport controller is fairly complicated in terms of getting to grip with what it actually does from a suspension calibration perspective at least. I want to add that this in no way supplants the fine work that Tom and Mike from TPC Racing have done. Everyone should watch their videos. They're super informative and highly educational. With that, let's talk first about comfort. Subjectively, comfort appears to largely be centered around a well-dampened suspension. Well, what is a well-dampened suspension, you might ask? Essentially, it feels comfortable. You can have an uncomfortable low spring rate car or a very comfortable car with high spring rates. Fast and jarring bumps are not pleasant, and floaty suspensions tend to give you a sense of a lack of control. So the trick is to find a default set of rates for the suspension that's not so hard as to be jarring and not so soft as to be floaty, and then dampen it with appropriate low speed, medium speed, and high speed damping such that sharp bumps are nicely absorbed and progressively slowed down via the dampers. From my experience, that's equally true on track. You don't want the car to get unsettled with bumps, and you don't want it to float up and down either. So as it turns out, you actually need more compression and rebound damping for track setups than you do for the road setups, but you want to have a higher base stiffness on the car. Then as the spring rate increases, all other things being equal, you typically want more rebound damping and less compression damping. Why, you might ask? Well, with a stiffer spring, it's harder to compress, so you don't need to damp that as much. But at the same time, with a stiffer spring, it rebounds more rapidly, so you need to damp that a little bit more. Then, of course, you need to take the weight distribution of the car into account for front versus rear, and that's where the spring ratios come into effect. You don't want the front to compress and rebound out of harmony with the rear, because that will lead to a double bounce. So the other important thing about that is that the different rates of compression and rebound damping between the front and rear will ensure, at least theoretically, assuming you have a flat ride, that the front and the rear, after going over a bump one after the other, essentially wind up oscillating out together, making it for a seeming smoother ride. When you get that right, the overall feeling of the car becomes more planted, becomes more comfortable, even with higher spring rates. On the flip side, when you get that wrong, your ride goes to hell in a handbasket, and your wife does not want to be in your 911. So, how do we solve this particular problem? First, let's take a quick tour through the DSC controller settings. What you see in front of you now is the DSC controller application. It runs only on Windows, so if you're on a Mac, you're kind of out of luck unless you've got an Intel-based Mac where you can use Boot Camp. Now, you'll notice that there are the G-force table, the brake table, the acceleration table, speed, steering, shock calibration, velocity, and settings. The first thing to note is we'll start off on the settings table. We have got tables for chassis normal, chassis sport, and driveline. When we select chassis normal, the screen will have or the window will have a yellow border. When we select chassis sport, it will have a red border, and when we select driveline, it will be a blue border. These are important visual cues for you to know what you're actually modifying. So let's talk about the G-force table. When you take a look at the G-force table, you'll see it's essentially a chessboard-like grid that has a number of cells in it, starting at the center where our G-forces laterally and longitudinally are 0. And it goes up in 0.2 G increments from 0.2 to 1.0. As you move towards the right-hand side of the table, the G-forces increase. Similarly, as you move towards the left side of the table, the G-forces increase. Now, when you move towards the right-hand side of the table, that means that you are making a left turn at an increasing rate of Gs. When you move towards the top of the table and the g-forces increase, that means that you're effectively decelerating a lot. Conversely, when you move to the back of the table, you'll be accelerating a lot. Then, if you're diagonally in the top right corner, you're both braking a lot and turning a lot at the same time. We've got a couple of interesting things that we can do there. Some DSC calibration files that I've seen have the left and the right wheel always exactly the same in terms of percentages. But I feel that that takes away a lot of the great functionality that you can get from the DSC Sport controller. If you look at this particular one, I've got 92.5% on the left front, 100% on the right front, 85% on the right rear, and 70% on the left rear. What does this do? Well, picture yourself making a very hard left turn while braking. A lot of weight on the front right wheel, the front outside wheel, a little bit less on the front inside wheel, and because you're braking, there's less weight on both the inside and the outside rear wheels. So to maximize your traction, you want those suspension values or the stiffness of your suspension to be a little bit less at the rear and certainly a little bit less on the inside front. Why so on the inside front? Picture yourself on a track, going around a corner, clipping the curb. You want there to be control in the inside wheel so that you can go up and down a little bit more readily and disturb the ride a little bit less. This, by the way, is what I am using for my own personal file, and I've made a couple of files based upon this that have a similar philosophy. Switching our attention briefly to the bottom of this table, there's the G-force or the G-comfort parameters. There are some interesting things that we can do there, but essentially what happens is the default rate applies, and that default rate is a percentage that indexes into the shock calibration table. With different values for the sensitivity and G-rate max parameters, the G-comfort patch will transition to the actual G-table sooner or later, depending on the value of those parameters. We'll get back to that a little bit later. Two other tables I want to kind of focus a little bit on is the shock calibration table and the velocity table. Firstly, the shock calibration table. Now, looking at the shock calibration table, what does this tell us? This gives us a left to right for the left front, left rear, and right rear dampers, where left is 0% and the right is 100%. This sets the actual current range because all of the dampers work on an electrical current. Different dampers, for example, the stock OEM dampers and the Bilstein B16 dampers use a range of 500 milliamps to 1500 milliamps for full stiff to full soft. The Tractive DDA use 500 to 2000 milliamps and Nitron Electron use 300 to 1800 milliamps. So what you do, depending upon the suspension dampers that you have, is you put in values for full soft in the one side and full hard on the other side, depending on the curve that you want, and I'll get to that curve a little bit later. You will put different values in there. As you can see from my file, I've got full soft for my comfort map and almost full soft for the rear at my comfort map. On the full hard side, I go all out on the front because I've got lower spring rates in the front than in the rear, as do all 911s, and not quite that soft at the rear. We'll get back to that a little bit later again. Switching to the velocity table. What we have is fairly similar in some regards in that you've got a row for left front, left rear, and right rear. We will ignore this LNC, which is launch control, for the purposes of this discussion. Next, we have a look at the columns: rebound low, rebound medium, rebound high. So low speed, medium speed, and high speed rebound, low speed, medium speed, and high speed compression damping for your damper. What is low speed? Low speed, according to DSC documentation, is 0 to 3 inches per second of vertical travel. Medium speed is 3 to 5 inches per second of vertical travel. And high speed damping is greater than 5 inches per second of damping. This table is crucial for dialing in your comfort settings to get your suspension feeling comfortable in normal mode, and conversely for making it feel very sporty in sport mode. For some of you who don't track, it's less important that your sport mode is to the max. For others who do track, you really want to pay attention to the values that you put in for low speed, medium speed, and high speed rebound and compression damping. This is where things start to get a little bit more complicated, because the difference between tractive DDA, nitron electron, Bilstein, and OEM suspensions, for example, are quite stark. The OEM and the Bilstein suspensions tend to react much slower than the tractive DDA and nitron electron suspensions. You might say, well, so what? What does that really mean? Well, what it means is that it affects how you program this for low speed, medium speed, and high speed rebound and compression damping. And in particular for things like OEM and Bilstein suspensions, you're going to need to want to focus on low speed compression and rebound damping much more than medium and high speed compression and rebound. Because by the time the event of the medium speed or the high speed damping occurs, you're way past needing to apply it, and so you need to actually take out most of your rebound and compression via low speed rebound and compression damping. On the flip side, nitron and tractive DDA have a lot more functionality available simply by virtue of the fact that they react much, much faster. And so you need to focus a little bit more on balancing your low speed, medium speed, and high speed rebound and compression damping. That said, you always want your low speed compression and rebound damping to be more than your medium speed compression and rebound damping, and that in turn to be more than your high speed compression and rebound damping. The theory remains the same, that your low speed compression and rebound damping does the big job of the damping, while the medium speed and the high speed damping really are fine tuning it, as it were. All right, let's now talk a little bit more about g-forces and the g-force table. While the onset of g-forces is a linear function, the response of a shock or a damper to increased g-force should not be linear. One of the reasons is because there's always a lag between the signal that's sent out to the damper to ask it to do something and how long it actually takes to respond. As I've noted earlier, some dampers, like the nitron electron and tractive DDA, respond very quickly, 6 to 10 milliseconds, versus the Bilstein and or the OEM dampers, which take about 100 milliseconds to respond. Furthermore, if damping's strictly linear with respect to g-force, and thus roughly linear with overall suspension displacement or velocity in many scenarios, you'd face a compromise. If you tuned it to be stiff enough for good low-speed control, handling high g-force cornering, it will be too harsh over bumps, high-speed impacts, which can also induce g-spikes. If you tuned it to be soft enough for good ride comfort over bumps, it would be too wallowy and uncontrolled during aggressive maneuvers, and again, with sustained g-forces. So the trick is, how do we deal with that? So ideally you want a digressive damping curve. In other words, you want a relatively high damping force at low suspension velocities, which are good for controlling body roll, dive, and squat. And as the suspension velocity increases, like when hitting a sharp bump, in other words, the vertical travel of your suspension increases, the rate of the damping force increase needs to slow down. In other words, your curve flattens. This allows the wheel to move more quickly to absorb the impact and improves ride quality over rough surfaces without sacrificing control during high-speed maneuvers. So when you induce lateral Gs by turning, or when you introduce longitudinal Gs by either braking hard or accelerating hard, you want to have a rapid initial response to the onset of g-force. That means your initial jumps from 0G to 0.2G to 0.4G should elicit a stronger response from the suspension than the later jumps from 0.6 to 0.8 to 1G, and so on. All right, so g-force, we get it. You go and fill in some values in the g-force table, but what about this velocity table, you might ask? How do we actually fill values in there? Well, when you get right down to it, there really should be a relationship between the front and rear compression and damping rates. And there should also be a relationship between compression and rebound damping for a given axle. These ratios, front and rear, unsurprisingly enough at any rate, are very close to the ratios of your spring rates from front to rear. There's some variation there, obviously, with a lower ratio for the normal mode settings and a slightly higher ratio for the sport mode settings. Looking at the values that came stock with the DSC controller, and this is where I do have a bit of a criticism, it's hard to determine any kind of ratio whatsoever between compression and rebound damping, between front and rear axles, between low speed, medium speed, and high speed damping, and in fact there are some negative values floating around. And honestly, I don't understand the negative values. There may well be some reasonable explanation for it, but frankly, my feeling is that you do not want to soften up your suspension when you were already at a specific G load and you hit a bump. That just does not feel intuitively right. These values might have been somewhat appropriate for stock OEM suspension setups, but in my experience, and my only other friend in the world, thank you Jimmy, they're wildly inappropriate for any kind of a modified suspension. So if you've modified your suspension, you probably should be looking at redoing this table. Essentially what we have with respect to the velocity table is a set of values. There's no relationship between them, as I noted, and no progression for low, medium, or high speed settings, and no relationship between compression and rebound values. To me, it's chaos. And with chaos, you can't have a good suspension setup. So those are critical, in my mind, to get right. With our rearward weight biased cars for a given spring rate ratio to restate, the compression and rebound damping settings should vary similarly in intensity between front and rear axles. There should be a relationship between compression and rebound damping in general, such that rebound damping should be somewhat greater in intensity than compression damping for aggressive track driving, but closer to a 1-to-1 ratio for street driving. Although, if you have a very large disparity between your front and your rear spring rates, you can't quite get to that 1-to-1 ratio. When it comes to aggressive track driving, you actually need more compression and rebound damping as opposed to street driving. And in order to regain more body control, you really need to first focus on low speed damping, then medium speed damping, and then finally high speed damping. In other words, you need to view medium and high speed damping as refinements of low speed damping, which in turn implies that low speed damping is bigger than medium speed damping is bigger than high speed damping in terms of absolute values. So here's where the magic happens. As I said earlier, there's a mathematical relationship between front and rear axles and between rebound and compression damping. So what does that really mean? Well, it means that you actually need to decide on one value and one value only, and that's front axle low speed compression. Once you've got that, you can use a mathematical relationship to determine the appropriate value, or at least the starting point for appropriate values for everything else. So how do we get past that? Well, we go out and we do a little bit of driving. We put in some values for the low speed compression and rebound damping, but we really are focused on the compression damping at this point. And we see how the car reacts. We start getting to a relatively stable position where we feel that the compression, in other words, the car going down, is okay. It doesn't matter if it bounces a couple of times afterwards because we can adapt that a little bit later. Once we have that one value, we can apply a formula to get us our medium speed and our high speed damping and apply that to everything else. I have found that in general, the ratio from front to rear axle for normal street driving is typically around 1.1 to 1.3. But for more aggressive track damping, it's around 1.2 to 1.6, depending again on spring rates. For compression to rebound damping, oddly enough, I find a similar ratio, but a little bit closer to 1-to-1. So typically about 1.0 to 1.2 for street and about 1.1 to 1.5 for track driving. Once you've got that, you find that your ride is improved tremendously. And you then need to go and do some more testing and more refinement. So this is a very iterative process. To put things in perspective, it's taken me some 29 to 30 revisions to get my DSC calibration files to a state where I like them. And that brings me to another point. Suspension settings are inherently very personal. What one person might like, another person might hate. And that's largely because people have very different driving styles and different perceptions of things and different tolerances for the way that the car behaves. Some people might like a lot of understeer. Some might like a lot of oversteer. Some people might like a neutrally balanced car. Some people are quite fine with a lot of NVH, and other people really cannot stand that. And the same is true for suspension. Some people like a soft floaty ride. Some people like a hard crashy ride. Some people like a ride that's somewhat in between. And so what I have done works wonderfully for me. It may not work wonderfully for you. It might require some minor tweaks, it might require some major tweaks, or you might say, I don't know what the hell he's smoking. It just doesn't make sense to me and this is crazy. I'm going to go back and use the standard OEM files from DSC and TPC Racing. That's okay. The purpose of this was really to give people some better understanding as to the thought process behind creating a number of DSC calibration files and the philosophy behind suspension that is needed in order to make those files work for you. So if you found this video useful, go down below where you see the comment section and let me know. If you've got questions for another video, let me know and I'll see what I can do to put something together. Thanks so much for watching, everyone. So the trick is to find a set of rates. Is harder so as it turns out, we'll do that again. The different rates of compression and rebound damping between front and rear. You might want a sportier ride for comfort, trend in your G-force graph. Well, when you get right down to it, there should be a relationship between front and rear axles.